Today, I wanted to spend a few seconds to talk about multi-factor authentication, which is a powerful tool that you can use to keep yourself, your family, and your organization safe online. The bad guys know that most people will use the same password for multiple sites, perhaps in some cases, every site, which of course is a terrible technique and sets you up for easy hacking. Bad guys know this, whether it's credential dumps online or the fact that they might be using brute force techniques like credential stuffing to attack your accounts. They know that the average person has these bad password habits, and it's one of the reasons why we talked about password managers in the last episode of this. Password managers will go a long way towards helping you generate strong, unique passwords for each site to protect your accounts. But multi-factor authentication will really give you an exponential leap over anything else you can do in terms of protecting your accounts from the average hacker. So again, multi-factor authentication's been around for a while. The problem with it is it's often described in different ways depending on which particular site you're talking about. It's sometimes called two-step verification. It's sometimes called two-factor authentication, and it could be called something else on another site. So you'll typically see it abbreviated as MFA for multi-factor authentication or 2FA for two-factor authentication, and they more or less mean the same thing, which is in addition to supplying your username and password, your typical user credentials, you'll be required to supply an additional code that will grant access to your site. And it basically works like this. So once you enable multi-factor authentication on a site, it's going to require you to supply this additional code, sometimes known as a one-time passcode or OTP. There are different mechanisms around how this works, but the concept is not new. In fact, if you've ever used an ATM machine, you're already familiar with and have experienced multi-factor authentication of a sort, because it typically boils down to different information that would be available to you. Either something you have, in the case of an ATM, your bank card, something you know, in the case of the ATM, your PIN, or something you are, which could be something like a fingerprint or a retinal scan or a facial recognition or some other type of biometric information. So those are typically the three factors you're working with: something you know, something you have, something you are. So in the case of this online type multi-factor authentication used to access a platform or a website, this something you know, of course, is your username and password, and then something you have will be the one-time passcode that gets sent to you as part of this process. It does introduce some friction into the authentication process, but the value that it provides in terms of additional security is well worth the friction. Any number of experts have weighed in on this, and I think it's really important to note and hopefully drive home the point that both Microsoft and Google within the last year or so have come out and said that their testing shows that multi-factor authentication will stop about 99% of all automated attacks. Let me say that again. Multi-factor authentication will stop about 99% of all automated attacks. I mean, that's pretty impressive. Now, if you're a high-profile individual and you're being targeted by some sort of nation-state actor, sometimes called an advanced persistent threat or APT, if Iran wants to steal your secrets, or North Korea or Russia, multi-factor authentication may not be enough to stop them, but it is going to stop the average hacker. And a big part of this is just trying to make yourself a harder target so that the bad guys will move on to a softer target. If your house has an alarm system, you have a big dog, you have exterior lighting, and the house next door doesn't have any of those things, the average criminal is going to break into the house next door. If, of course, the bad guys know that you happen to have the Hope Diamond in your house, they might be willing to take a chance and will attempt to circumvent all of your defenses and break into your house anyway. So again, multi-factor authentication is not foolproof, but it will go a long way towards protecting you, your organization, and your family from the average hacker. The trick, of course, is knowing how to turn it on, and that unfortunately varies from one site to the next. Not every site supports it, and again, it's going to add some friction, so some people will find it somewhat cumbersome and frustrating to use when they first turn it on. My advice to you echoes the advice of many experts out there, which is you should enable multi-factor authentication anywhere and everywhere you can. Most banks have been using this sort of technology coupled with other analytic technology for a long time. So for example, when you go to log into your bank, in addition to requiring a one-time passcode, they might also do things like look at where you are, or how long it takes you to complete the login process, because obviously if someone is trying to hack you, it could take them a while to have access to this information, and thus, after a certain period of time, they'll stop the authentication process because they realize that, or at least they suspect that it might not be legit. So with multi-factor authentication, again, you really should turn it on everywhere you can. All the big social media platforms support it. All the big email platforms, productivity platforms like Office 365 support it. And in many cases, it's just, again, simply a matter of knowing how to turn it on. There's a site out there called twofactorauth.org. Again, that's twofactorauth.org, and that is essentially just a compendium of sites that support two-factor authentication, and then or multi-factor authentication, and how they support it. Because there's different ways it can ultimately be implemented. For most people, if they've used it before, they've experienced it using the SMS or text-based multi-factor authentication, which boils down to, once MFA is configured, you enter your standard credentials, your username and password, and then the site you're trying to log into will send a text to your phone that typically has a 6-digit code, and you're required to enter that 6-digit code before you can access your site. Text-based authentication, again, text-based multi-factor authentication is by far the most prevalent way people do this. But there are other ways, including things like YubiKey hardware keys. That's going to be, in the most extreme circumstances, probably not something the average person is going to do. And then somewhere between the SMS in and then something like a hardware key in is an authenticator app, which is what I would generally recommend to folks. Authy is a well-known authenticator app. Google makes an authenticator app. Microsoft makes an authenticator app. LastPass makes an authenticator app. And there are others out there. And what the authenticator app does is makes it even more difficult for the hackers to attack your accounts, because rather than send a one-time password via text or SMS to your cell phone, your cell phone or smartphone is synced up between the authenticator app and the site on the other end with a shared secret. And once that's configured correctly, the code is sent to that app. So essentially a push notification goes out. Let's say you're trying to log into LinkedIn. You go to log into LinkedIn. It sends a push notification to the authenticator app on your phone. You'll get notified that you're trying to log in, and you can, of course, confirm or deny that you want to log in, and you simply hit a button, and at that point, the login will be completed. The reason why this is better in the long run than the text-based authentication is, first off, if you don't have cellular service, you may not be able to get the text and thus might not be able to log in. But more importantly, there's a type of attack out there that's actually happened to Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, and it's happened to other high-profile individuals, called SIM swapping. Chances are folks out there viewing this video may have had their phone number transferred from one physical cell phone to another. That's an instance of a legitimate SIM swap, where you go to most people would go to their cell phone store, and they would have that transferred. So the SIM, the subscriber identity module, is essentially a code that ties you to that phone. If the phone dies, if you want to upgrade your phone, they can transfer that. Well, bad guys will often use social engineering techniques to attempt to get a cellular carrier to transfer a cell phone number from cell phone A to a phone that's in their possession, at which point, of course, they would have access to your texts and could potentially log into your accounts if they also had access to your passwords. Again, that's probably far-fetched for the average person and not very likely, but the Authenticator app makes it that much more difficult, because the shared secret that occurs, or the shared secret that's used to link the Authenticator app to a website. So you download an Authenticator app like Authy on your phone, you want to connect it to, let's say, Twitter or Facebook, so you go into the settings. Most of the time they will show a QR code. You scan that QR code with your phone, thus establishing the shared secret between your phone and that site. And now the bad guys would have to physically have possession of your phone, be able to unlock your phone, go to the Authenticator app to get that one-time passcode, and the one-time passcode generally will expire after 30 or 60 seconds. So the likelihood that the bad guys will be able to take physical possession of your phone, unlock the phone, and get those passcodes, very slim. I can't say it's impossible, Again, multi-factor authentication is not entirely foolproof, but if you enable it, and particularly when coupled with a multi-factor authenticator app like Authy, again, there are others, Google, Microsoft makes one, LastPass, as I mentioned before, you are going to vastly increase the security of any accounts where multi-factor authentication is enabled. You're going to make it much, much, much more difficult for someone to break into any of those accounts. Even if they manage to steal your password, they would need to be able to get the correct one-time passcode and use that to log into your account. So you're really making it exponentially more difficult for the bad guys. So in summary, multi-factor authentication, it's not new. Most sites support it. If you're not sure about a site, you can search in the help on that site. You can check out twofactorauth.org to see if they're aware if a site supports it. And if and then the various mechanisms that's supported. One of the things that's nice about two-factor auth is they'll say, okay, this site does not support multi-factor authentication. This site supports it, but only SMX or text-based authentication. This site supports it, and they support, SMS or authenticator app or hardware keys or some of the other more advanced mechanisms that are out there. So it's a good resource to learn more about multi-factor or two-factor authentication in general and which sites support it, and also can help you quickly determine which sites support it and which sites don't. Now, my friends call me Doomsday Dave because I'm very paranoid about these sort of things. I can tell you in general, I would not use a site that doesn't support multi-factor authentication, especially if it contains personally identifiable information, PII, about me or my family, protected health information about me or my family, something like a MyChart type app where you might be sharing information with your doctors and nurses, that sort of thing. Certainly any sort of banking app or insurance app, things where real financial damage could be done to you. Maybe a 401k third-party administrator type site. And anything that involves finances and particularly the transfer of funds should be secured with multi-factor authentication. Your primary email account should be secured with multi-factor authentication because in many cases, your primary email account will be, that email address will be part of user credentials you're using on other sites. As a result of that, in many cases, someone who might be trying to break into a site might send a password reset to that account. So if they can break into that primary email account, they might be able to use that as leverage to break into other accounts. So again, in addition to the all-encompassing advice of use a strong password that's unique for every site. Ideally, use a password manager to manage those. And if you do use a password manager, you definitely should enable multi-factor authentication on it to protect your other passwords. But in general, wherever you can, use multi-factor authentication. If you watch this and you're still unclear about why you need it, just remember both Microsoft and Google have said multi-factor authentication, MFA or 2FA will stop 99% of all automated attacks. And if you still have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and I will be happy to try to answer your questions. But multi-factor authentication, do it today. Thanks.